Shabbat Shalom. So let's see who was paying attention to the Torah reading. Who is on the west side of the marching camp as we go? All right, so it's okay. It's not a trick question, but it was a question that I was expecting that most of us had just sort of, had allowed that detail to go by. Even as Natan chanted it so cleanly and clearly, many of us were probably not captivated by the orientation of all of the tribes in the camp or the marching order that was being described. The totals were of moderate interest, perhaps, but, do we really need to know that Judah was on the east and Reuben was on the south? I mean, is this exactly what God wanted to waste ink on in the Torah? Couldn't we have gotten more of that whole, love your neighbor as yourself kind of stuff, or maybe squeeze another holiday in if we have a little bit more room without having to go through the encampments? Well, obviously, we are not the first generation to scratch our head and ask why there was such detail given here. And of course, our commentators will fixate not just on that it's here, but some of the key points. You would have noticed, I am sure, that at the beginning of the reading for this morning, it talked not just about which camp was where, but very explicitly that they were arranged according to the degel, the flag of their ancestral homes. All right, why would we arrange them by the flag, and why would that matter? Well, says Rashi, they had to be arranged by the flag because they needed to know where to stand. All right, you need to know where you are, and if anyone here has ever been in a parade or other large group organization that's out marching and moving, you need some kind of symbols to help people orient, and each one being a different color, says Rashi, would allow people to know, that's mine. However, not every commentator agrees with Rashi that it was just a question of having a banner waving with a particular color. I could also argue that simply from a practical point of view, speaking personally, if I was trying to differentiate between 12 different colors from a distance on sticks, I would probably get lost and end up standing in the wrong camp. So maybe we needed something more than just a little bit of a color on the cloth hanging from that stick. And that's where our ancestors said in the commentaries that indeed they did have other symbols. They're right above me right now. What is it that's up there on our stained glass window from the oldest synagogue in Orlando? The symbols of the tribes. And those are not just blotches of color. They have particular motifs that are easier to identify from a distance and certainly easier to differentiate between how many shades of blue we might be able to put on 12 different banners. So the symbols were important. Now Ibn Ezra says, yes, but now that we know that the symbols were on those banners, now we can look at it a little bit more carefully. And through our understanding of those symbols, which I have to point out, not all of them are up on that stained glass window, because Ephraim and Manasseh are not included in that, because Joseph is, whereas in our camp it was Ephraim and Manasseh and not Joseph. We can talk about how that worked out another time, but what he found was a very interesting parallel. If you look at the east, the south, the west, and the north, you will find that there is one tribe in each one of them that has a very particular symbol that, taken together as a cluster of 4, actually matches something very significant. To do this, you have to also transfer your mind into the prophet Ezekiel's vision, where Ezekiel sees angels that have how many faces? 4. And if you look at each one of the 4 faces, there is a tribe with each one of those faces stationed in the 4 corners of the camp, which means that the camp itself becomes a sort of living representative of Ezekiel's vision of the angels, which are, of course, supporting God. And what is it that we find equally importantly in the middle of this camp? The Mishkan itself, the tabernacle. So, says it's very simple. We had to have the flags so that as we oriented ourselves and we saw the 4 different faces of the angels standing around the Ohel Moed, we would recognize that we were God's emissaries, God's malachim, on earth. And that just as the angels above would support Adonai in heaven, we are supporting Adonai represented through the tabernacle and the ark here on earth. You see, those details matter. It's not just a question of a bunch of people got organized. The details matter. But as beautiful as Ibn Ezra's insight is, and as inspiring as it is, I think there is a more basic reason why we had these banners in the first place. And to understand that, we need to go back 80 years into more recent history. This last week, there was an 80th anniversary of one of the most important battles in all of human history. The Battle of? Excellent. You've all been paying attention to that. D-Day. Right, why was D-Day such a critical point for human history?
Because they were finally the Allied power from Britain and Europe, and they took the west side.
So the Allies were finally able to land in Europe on the west side of the continent and begin rolling back the Nazi war machine until its eventual destruction less than a year later, which is quite miraculous given how powerful the Nazis had become by that point. And D-Day itself was a miraculous event. There were just amazing amounts of coincidences that allowed D-Day to go off as well as it did, not taking away from the horrible cost of human lives, but D-Day almost didn't happen, and even when it happened, it almost didn't work. And had D-Day failed, or had it necessarily been postponed indefinitely, well, one of 2 things might have happened. One, there might have been a suing for peace, and the Western Allies might have indeed said, you know, maybe we can get France back, but we'll sue for peace with Nazi Germany and allow them to control many of their other territories. Their world was quite weary of war at this point. Or 2, perhaps we wouldn't be able to invade timely, still keep the pressure on Nazis, and the Soviet Union would have continued to roll in from the east, and the Soviet Union would not have stopped at Berlin. They would have continued to conquer the rest of the continent, as was kind of their intention, had there not been an Allied army that was coming from the west that would say, thanks for the help against the Germans, but no, you don't get to take the rest of the continent. This was a pivotal point for human history because all of the world was captured in this conflict, and had D-Day not happened the way it did, there would have continued to be horrible human slaughter under the Nazis or under the Soviets in the years that would have followed afterwards, which we shouldn't even begin to imagine how dark that would have been. But for those who are history buffs of D-Day, we all know that there are different beaches throughout Normandy that were stormed by different contingents from the different countries. The Americans had certain beaches, the Canadians had certain beaches, the British had certain beaches, the Australian forces had some other places, and then there were some multinational groups thrown in as well. Logistically, as an armchair general, that doesn't make sense. After all, the forces were uneven. Why not take some of the American troops and add them to supplement some of the British or Canadian troops, and vice versa? Use some of the hardware that was found in one army with a different army in order to even out the ability of the regiments that were going onto the different beaches at different times. I mean, after all, most of the assault force were English speakers, and yes, the Americans do count as English speakers, even to the British. And they would have been able to communicate quite easily through each other. So why not just mix up the forces until you get the perfect blend in every assault group in order to maximize your successes when you go forward? Any ideas of why that was not considered a great idea? Just, take a few random Americans, a few random Canadians, a few random British people, throw them together, and boom. So each army has a particular methodology. I mean, yes, you point the gun at the enemy and pull the trigger, that may be universal, but the precise way that orders are handed out, the precise way that one would assault a hardened position, those are trained again and again and again in particular detail, unique to each army, and indeed unique often to each regiment or maybe even platoon. There may be a general idea of what you are meant to do, but the particulars, which are drilled at a much more granular level. And when you go into combat, you need to know that the guy next to you is going to be doing X, Y, and Z at precisely the time you expect it, so that you can do A, B, and C in a way that will cooperate, complement, and lead to an ultimate success. So logistically, it's not great to mix, but perhaps it still would have worked in order to strengthen some of the weaknesses of others, or at the very least, morally. After all, some of the beaches were much harder to take, and some of the casualties at different beaches were much higher than others. Perhaps it would have only been right to share the burden of the more difficult assaults by spreading out people from different nations so that no one nation would bear the worst of it at any particular point. Well, yes, that has some attractiveness, but it's also forgetting a fundamental point. It's not only that the soldiers train together and understand what is expected of each of them and the mechanics that it goes into it, and they have the drill down and they know, step one, step two perfectly in sync with each other. It's also that they have each other. Soldiers, when they go into battle, are inspired by the leaders of the nation. They are inspired perhaps by the generals. They are maybe driven by the sergeants. But ultimately, their heart, their passion, and their courage is going to be linked to the person next to them, to their friend, to their comrade, the person that they have been training with at this point for weeks, months, perhaps even longer, depending upon which group we are talking about. That they are not just fighting as a cog within a giant war machine. They are fighting with their brothers against something that is attacking not just their way of life, not just rippling across the pages of history, but someone is trying to kill their friend. Someone is trying to kill their brother. And when you have that conception of the person next to me is more than just another comrade within our giant apparatus, but is actually with me, you fight harder. You fight clearer. You fight with a deeper sense of trust that they too are fighting for you. Being able to know and trust that person next to you is essential to the ultimate victory that you are hoping to achieve. And with that in mind, we can turn back to Bamidbar, and we can understand that while it might have been tempting to simply homogenize the entire Jewish people, to simply say, look, we're all Jews, we were all slaves in Egypt, and okay, maybe we'll give some special jobs for the Levi'im and the Kohanim, but all the rest of us, who cares that your great-great-great-granddad was Judah or Reuben or Zebulun? We'll just all be Israelites now, and everyone just, we need 100,000 people there, 100,000 people there, and so on around the square, and we'll all just be mixed in together. Well, as tempting as it is to imagine that we can simply be homogenized into one giant blended Jewish mass, it turns out that actually allying ourselves, lining up next to the people that are our brothers, our cousins, our uncles, the people that are from our immediate family tree, does create a different resolve, a different strength than simply being homogenized with Jew number 259,603. Knowing these people, having grown up with them, having shared the burden of life together with them, created a different esprit de corps that could not be duplicated no matter how many beautiful sermons Moshe might have wanted to give. And God understood this. The tribal alliances were an essential part of Jewish identity. It's hard for us to understand that in the modern world, because the tribal alliances have long since been shattered and scattered due to the various conquests and dispersions of our people. But you can see a trace of it, and you can hopefully feel a trace of it when you feel of congregational alliance, of what does it mean to belong to a synagogue, What does it mean to belong to a particular community? Is there a resolve? Is there a passion that comes from knowing not just that there are other people in the room, but these are people that are part of my immediate, intimate community? Not that we turn our back on those other outside, any more than Judah would turn its back on Reuben when going out into battle, but to recognize that there is a more intimate core of Jewish people, a more intimate battalion that we galvanize through our concentration within a particular community for more regular activities that we can here drill under our drill sergeant Ilana today, in our prayers, bind ourselves together in our esprit de corps, and then be a more efficient fighting machine, not only for accomplishing the tasks that are before our particular congregation, but also accomplishing tasks outside, whether it be in the community, the Jewish community at large, whether it be in the general Orlando community, or on a bigger stage even still. Those flags mattered. That arrangement of people mattered. It mattered because the individuals that were inside each one of those smaller groups knew that the people around them mattered. Judaism may speak much to the individual, and it may demand much of the individual, but Judaism is not ultimately an individualistic faith. It is communal. We are bound one to another. The tribal affiliations were an effective and a necessary form in the past, and in the modern world, congregational or city and community-wide binding is something that gives us a similar type of strength. But only if we actually pay attention to it. Only if when we come to shul, we don't see ourselves as just an individual sitting in a pew. Only when we go to a community event, we don't just see ourselves as one person who happens to be attending, but we recognize when we stand together that we are indeed together in a way that should move us to reach higher and to find strength that perhaps individually we don't think we have. As we have seen just today with the miracle of 4 more people being rescued from Gaza, there is an amazing ability within the spirit of us to reach heights that would not have been thought possible. When others have given up hope, miracles can still happen if we recognize that we are standing together and that together we are able to achieve anything. Shabbat Shalom.